Javier Rivera, how we doing?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing all right. So what you been thinking about? Oh, and I have a question for you. Does it all come down to choice, Javier? Does at the end of the day, everything come down to choice? Is that ultimately what it's all about? The ability to choose well? Is that what it comes down to, Javier Rivera?
Oh, well, I mean, geez, even the ability to choose well is a choice, isn't it?
Yeah, there you go.
Um,
Cadell Last, ladies and gentlemen. Cadell Last, how we doing? We just spoke with Peter
Dell,
Rollins. It was super cool. Love that guy. So, Javier,
What
does
up?
it all come
Hey,
down to
Javier.
choice? Yeah, I can hear you. How you doing, Cadell?
All good, man. Great to see you both.
It's good to see you, my friend. Javier is going to tell us if it all comes down to choice at the end of the day. The ability to choose well, quality of decision, choice of your metaphysical framework, and commitment to it. Does it all come down to choice, Javier?
yeah, in my opinion, is that without choice, it can't be risk, right? Can't have any
Mm.
risk without choice. But something I have been thinking about recently, and it'd be interesting to discuss this with you two, is the necessity for epistemological failure for comedy to exist. So basically, what I'm saying is like, if we had no epistemological failure, we wouldn't have comedy. We wouldn't be able to laugh. We wouldn't have
Mm.
that kind of enjoyment. And I've been thinking about how kind of like hilarious that is and how horrible it would be to know everything, right? In the sort of maybe broad general society sense, right? When we say know everything, right? Because if you were to know everything, then the joke is not funny. Right? And so I've been thinking about like how hilarious that is that we really need epistemological failure to exist, or you just wouldn't be able to laugh. And I would be like, so you don't want to laugh? You don't like laughing? Like that's what I'm hearing. And then you get that Nietzsche argument where it's like it's courageous to laugh because that is the epistemological failure of things.
Mm.
So yeah, those have just been like my brief thoughts.
It's very interesting you bring this up because I was going to ask Mr. Rollins, what is it? Why is he funny? Like, why is there something very funny about this idea of like, he's really funny? Zizek is really funny. I'm actually kind of skeptical of philosophers that are not funny or able to laugh. They may not need to be a comic, but they have to have some ability to see a joke. And like, what if there is something about the joke that actually seems to be deepest ontological revelation, right? And there's something about like one of the things. So there's a few things I'm curious with Mr. Rollins, or maybe in general, like what might be the distinctions between three categories. One, a God of whom doesn't exist at all. Two, the unknown God of like a Master Eckhart, and three, the unknowing God that Mr. Rollins is talking about. What are the three? Are there differences between those three? Are they actually the same? And there's also something about when you talk about, like he was talking about as well. So is this idea that you go to church to come to be at home with your lack? And how why is it that the moment I say that, that actually feels funny even to say? Like you're going to church in order to come home with your lack, and you go, oh, that's funny. And I think laughter is also interesting because when do you laugh? One, when you're like joyful, but two, when you're crazy. And it's similar to the tear when you cry when you're really sad, but also before great beauty. And we tend to see an what if deepest reality is that very either or? Like the only proper response to the deepest realities is an either or, where it is equally both, that then speaks to the ambiguity that itself is deepest reality in some way. Like you laugh because it's horrifying, but the laughter of the horror is like the horror is beautiful, or the sadness is beautiful, or the beauty is sad. Like this ability to have this bothness, and we always talk in Hegel, the I, other, the AB, and it's like the laughter and the tear are a revelation of the AB versus the AA. And it's something funny because I guess what I've been thinking about is how the instinctual laugh, like you don't plan to laugh, you just laugh. Like if you plan to laugh, you don't really laugh. Like it's almost like an instinctual resonance with deepest revelations that tend to come from a Zizek or a Peter Rollins. Like you go, ha! And the fact that you laugh is almost more reliable than the feeling that is correct. Like, when you hear and go, oh, that's correct. Well, what if the laughter is like the most reliable piece of evidence that something is a kind of revelation of something deeper there? Whereas we confuse the deepest confirmation is actually with the check mark in our head. Now, I'm not taking a hard position on that, but I just find it very interesting that why are, like, in my opinion, most of the best philosophers, and actually a lot of the best writers, have some sort of sense of the comic as actually being not merely entertaining, but almost ontological. Like there's something about the comic that's almost ontological. So I think what you're getting at is quite interesting.
This This when you were talking about this, I immediately think about God is dead as like a John Cena joke. Like you can't see me. You know? Or or like those camouflage memes where this guy's like having like a he's in camouflage. He's like, damn, it's so sad. This guy's sitting alone, right, with his partners in like full camouflage, right? And this is kind of like I feel like if I were to make theological memes, like this is what I would make, right? Or I'd be like, this is ideology, like you can't see him, you can't. But again, it's funny because it's like it already shows the kind of failure about understanding ideology and like understanding these things. And it's weird, like you're pointing out, Daniel, that somehow we intuitively know without really kind of like probably really processing it. When we laugh, we find it funny. And it's weird because we don't even know sometimes why we find it funny. It's just the way the comic sets it up, and then the way he plays with the scene of the problem, and then we start laughing because for some reason the comic has this tendency to show how ridiculous it is, how ridiculous the whole situation is in retrospect. But like knowledge seems to do the same thing in retrospect too, right? Like, oh my God, can you believe I thought God exists? Like it has that kind of like funny thing in the background. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, that's wonderful. And T-Tom, good to see you. And Mr. Jockin, it's a pleasure. And T-Tom, Mr. Jockin, good to see you. Mr. Jockin had a wonderful review of Belonging again because he's a saint. Thank you for that, sir. That was very kind of you and greatly appreciated. And thank you for going through that. And we're talking about why is it that our response to some of like the deepest revelations is laughing. Like I think about how Zizek is funny, Peter Rollins is quite funny, and there's kind of this comedy that kind of comes out when you confront the lack of reality, but then you also laugh when you're overwhelmed with joy. And also there's a tear before great beauty and also great sadness, where it's like an instinctual response to some sort of sense of something deep that kind of clicks. And then you can't help but kind of laugh or kind of like cry. Like you can also laugh to hide embarrassment, as Mr. Javier is pointing out. And so it's interesting and it makes me think of Chitan, where you were talking about language, right? The problems of language. And it's almost like piercing through the language game. It's like, oh, we're always kind of engaging in this meta language, trying to figure out the right way to say it. And if somebody laughs, then it's almost like evidence that it's worth trying to wrestle through the language to get at something. It's like, oh, maybe there is nothing here, but at least now we have evidence that there's something worth trying to get at. The same with crying. Like, oh, if you cried in this experience, it's almost like a sorting mechanism. Like, how do we decide what we're even going to think about? How are we going to decide what we're even going to try to talk about? If there's a presence of tears and the presence of laughter, that would be evidence. And then and I'll give it to Chitan here, we can make a choice about what that means, and it would come down maybe to a choice. But Chitan, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Good to be here. Yeah, I have this very favorite author called Doris Lessing, books I really love reading. And she used to say this, that laughter is a mechanism that sort of we've evolved to keep two things together which don't quite fit together in that sense. When two things in the human psyche come together, which sort of create this excess of energy, and you don't know what to do with it. The laughter is a mechanism, sort of that bridges that discord in that sense. So laughter is at the heart of all negativity in that form of thinking. I always like sort of saying what she says over there, because if you think about it, what are the ways human beings can we can handle things which follow one from the other, but what are the ways through which we again handle information that are inbuilt in certain forms of failure, which do not follow from one to the other immediately, which do not have this certainty of logic, certainty of thinking that what this. I think there's something like laughter is inbuilt into that, that kind of failure through which knowledge sort of, constitutively have to emerge from and engage within.
Yeah, it makes me think, like Peter Rollins was talking about, kind of the Zupancha and Cadell in his video on Zupancha, on the idea that when you fall from Eden, then like the fall is actually then the retrospection created of an Eden and different things, which almost suggests in a funny way that the fall can be Eden if you learn to integrate with the lack, right? Like the fall itself, because you could almost say there's a difference between which paradise is better per se, the paradise where nothing bad happens, or the situation that regardless what bad happens, you can integrate with it, you can flip the script, you can actually use it in a manner that is beautifying or brings out life, right? Like there's the perfection that never is confronted, and then there's the perfection that is a result of having the skill to handle whatever comes at you. And it's almost like there's a difference between the laugh of, oh, I'm nervous and I'm not going to be able to handle this snake, and then the laughter of, oh, the snake came at me and I actually was able to flip the script and use it in a manner that would bring about an even better state or a fuller state or something like that. And it's interesting how it's almost like the laugh also suggests one, a vulnerability, you're hiding your vulnerability, or it's, man, how crazy the world is. Who would have known that facing hardship was the way to actually have a happier joy? Who would have known that actually being, Walker Percy at the beginning of Message in the Bottle, it kind of makes me think of Durkheim talks about where people are happiest when a thunderstorm's coming. Like when there's a massive hurricane, like there's community finally. Everyone's like, man, you hear about the storm coming? That's so great. But then when it's like happy and there's nothing wrong, everyone's kind of bored, right? Like we don't have a reason to get together. So it's interesting to think that there is something about the laugh that is the coming to terms with that reality. And it's almost like if the linchpin of life then is more skill-based, and Mr. Rollins was saying as well, like skill-based, art-based, being able to know how to time things, put it together, well, then it's the laughter of, I don't have the skill, what am I going to do? Or the laughter of, I'm able to handle it. And it kind of points to a reality that is more about learning various art forms or various skills than it is various states. But then that goes back, something I've been thinking about, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. I've been thinking a lot about this question of choice and judgment. And I've also been thinking, I was talking with my beloved friend, Mr. Paul Chen, about how do you make good decisions? Like, what is the process by which you go for good decisions? And one of the things we talked about that I'd be happy to elaborate is that the role of like the humanities, literature, the arts, one of the things is precisely to be training you to make quality decisions in situations that it is not clear what is good to do or not. Like, for example, like how do you make a decision, if we just use the great Hamlet example, how do we make a decision between revenge as moral or forgiveness as moral? In the situation, how do you make that decision? And you read about all these different characters that are in these kind of quandaries, and they have to make a choice, which might help you to think through choice making. And we were basically talking about how the humanities have not presented themselves as a training ground for getting better at choice making or to make quality decision. And so now in the pluralistic globalized world where people are confronted with a lot of information and uncertainty, they have to make decisions and they don't have the skill to make quality decision. I think that also gets tied to virtue and different things like that, which then of course, like how do you, if you encounter the laugh or you encounter the situation that makes you laugh, then if you don't have quality decision, it can be difficult to know how to choose to respond to that laughter or the situation that comes after that. So these things in my mind go together. But let me give it to Javier Rivera and then Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Rivera.
So there's a couple of things that I really struggle with ethics, mainly because ethics sometimes doesn't like to involve time. Like the minute we throw in time, like the decision of deciding whether an action is good or bad, it becomes extremely ambiguous in the context of time, right? But the thing is, we have to make a choice right now, right? This is what the law always demands. You have to make a decision now. This is the evidence. Make the decision now. What's ironic about choice is that choice also offers redemption. So there is a kind of ironic, weird negation of negation that kind of happens with choice. That also, the moment the decision is made, it also ceases, but then demands another choice. Which means that the demand for another choice is also an attempt at redemption, right? You can possibly redeem yourself or redeem the person that was kind of doomed, right? There's always that probability and that chance within choice because of its sort of infinite, finite capabilities. It ironically decides and also offers redemption at the same time, right? This is kind of like the idea of forgiveness and so on. But something that I've also been thinking about is this idea, and I put this on my Facebook post recently, this idea between trust and repetition. That when we talk about a joke, in order for a joke to work, the audience have to first actually believe and trust the very things that the comic is talking about. You know, he can't talk about jalapeno peppers if you don't actually believe jalapeno peppers exist, right? You have to have some sense of that those things actually exist in the world, and trust that those are real objects for the joke to work, right? If the audience have no understanding of the object that is being presented in the comedy skit, then it's just not funny. So what does this say about epistemological failure then? It means that epistemological failure demands your own stake in the game. You have to trust something. You have to believe in something. You have to lean on some type of structure of knowledge to then experience the epistemological failure, to then laugh about it. But if you have no structure of knowledge to lean on, then the joke is just not funny. There's nothing to laugh about because you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what this is. So it kind of reveals something interesting about even how do we get to the epistemological failure, right? What is the ground for the epistemological failure? And what I'm trying to argue in some of my thinking is like pranking, like the form of pranking is like the perfect example of showing how epistemological failure actually works. Mainly because if you prank somebody's like water bottle, right, and you fill it in with vodka, they actually trust that it's just water because they've repeatedly seen a bottle of water with just water. It's only until the moment they taste it and realize, wait a second, that's not water, that the joke is kind of funny, because what you've done is you've basically shown your friend the epistemological failure of always trusting that this water bottle dictates water, right? But what ends up happening now is that you put the subject through an epistemological shift where now he can look at a water bottle and be like, I don't know, it could be vodka now, right? So he might start getting a little skeptical and start sniffing the water bottle, right? But it's interesting that in order for the epistemological shift to even happen, the person needs to have an epistemological failure. But before the epistemological failure can even happen, he has to have gone through trust and repetition through a certain degree to believe in that object of knowledge, so that way he can encounter failure. And so basically when I say like, this is the version of faith that I'm playing with, faith as trust, not faith in the religious sentiment, but faith as a kind of trust in the object of knowledge that you've repeatedly encountered, where now finally you encounter a sort of epistemological failure. So you can have an epistemological shift. Now, how can we incorporate that with ethics? I'd be interested in doing.
That's a very interesting comment. And Mr. Fishman, good to see you, sir. We're talking about comedy, laughter, humanities, making decisions, and all other fun stuff. There will be, if you want a large fry, we can include that. I'm very interested. I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. It's interesting here because if in order to laugh, you have to believe something is real, then I can kind of situate you based on what you laugh at. I can kind of locate where you are or what kind of beliefs or what kind of world you are in based on what you laugh on. So there's a kind of test there, a kind of locating. And then the philosophers who know what makes a lot of people laugh, maybe that's like an indication that there's a high probability that their philosophy is going to apply to a lot of people because they're making a lot of people laugh about things that they're all kind of situated in. So there's something there about locating and laughter. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin, and Mr. Cheeton put a lovely quote from Doris Lessing. But Mr. Jockin, it is good to see you today, sir. And again, thank you for your very kind review. That was really appreciated.
Well, like I was saying, Daniel, thanks for writing a great book. That was a pleasure to read. So notes on that. Okay, so you know what's funny? I forgot the name of the actor. He played Walter White in Breaking Bad. I watched an interview with him, and he made a comment that good actors can't have to. It's almost basically emptying themselves. They have to not actually experience the intense emotion so that the audience can experience it. It's a kind of emptying deferment where the actor basically has to empty out themselves as that to experience the sensation, say a dramatic event or a funny event. And it's totally true. Like a comic, anyone who tells a joke and is laughing at their own joke as they're telling it I think all of us can affirm, totally dead. It doesn't work because you're getting in the way of the joke or the drama or the narrative or whatever to do its work. So a good actor has to be almost a receptacle emptying procedure to make the comedy actually work, both the drama or the narrative, for the sake of the audience, to gain that insight or experience instead. I was reminded of that actor talking about acting. The other note, just related to this question of ethics, and this is a little bit of a riff off, Daniel, your book, right? Belonging Again. It's funny when most of the time listening about this, any discussion about the good prior to modernity, which I can basically argue with basically Adam Smith and Ricard, right? Basically with economics. I say this because the discussion of the good, what was good for people, was always individualized. It was localized, it was individual, and it had this very exemplar model of referencing in morals of stories. He used narrative, he used all these apparatuses to communicate moral reasoning, versus the use of statistics and averages and aggregations. So, because look at today, any serious question of ethics is almost always answered with statistics, which may work in most cases. It's an argument of the works the best for the most. That's almost always the argument. But technically the wrong thing is the wrong thing, regardless if it's good for one person or everybody. I think the most exemplar moment is when then conflicting first principles run into each other, because statistical models can just work just as good for anyone else. Because also, by the way, a lot of times, the problem with statistical models is a lot of them are lag-based in time. So that has to lead to this ethics question. Meaning, for example, questions of dropping of religion may take probably multiple generations to show any significant sign that religiosity had any real powers of effect on social policy. A drop in religiosity from one generation to the next may not be enough. As one example, I'm just riffing off one point. More commonly in economics, we would say that certain indicators are basically laggard. They take couple cycles or seasons to show up. So if you just look at the instantaneous question of measurement and say, well, it's good now. Actually, a great example right now is inflation and other things like that. Because everyone goes, well, wait a minute, everything's fine. So look, everything's totally fine. Not realizing some of these stats they're using are lag based. You got to check back in 6 months or 3 months. Things like housing, for example. So I think I'm bringing up these points because it's saying, like, look how completely almost now. Actually, this is part of my note to Daniel on Belonging Again. Is the point that it's not like sociology and economics and all these other modes of reasoning by aggregations of statistical populations with the average as the abstractional object of reference. It's not like these don't work and they're not effective from getting good outcomes. That's the problem. We have to affirm that. But the problem is, maybe it's not. It only goes up to a certain point. I think the most powerful one is actually within the very earliest economics is the idea of status and position, actually which are non-utilitarian goods that are just as important for a social organization as basically electricity and food and water and all that. Status becomes very quickly, very rapidly, one of the major currencies of exchanges for goods and services. And a lot of times in questions of ethics, that is in play. Basically, the operation of dignity. All right, so this is a wild tangent. I'm going to bring us all back to the question of comedy, right? Because I remember from Aristotle, the idea that poetry was a more effective universal instrument of understanding than history, which I think out of us, everyone here we would all go the inverse, because it's pointing out the universal as an abstraction of a one, right? The kind of abstractional powers of a singular character who exemplifies as a mode of reasoning. So that's why I'll kind of bring us back there to that point. I'm done.
That was marvelous, Mr. Jockin. And Mr. Hunter Coates, it's a delight to see you today, sir. It's a pleasure. Everyone, he has written a tremendous book, bringing together the topic of conspiracy with Lacan. I had a wonderful time speaking with Hunter Coates. Mr. Coates, I hope you're doing well today. Generally, we're talking about comedy, decision-making. We were talking about Mr. Rivera was making the point that there has to be a kind of epistemological failure that tends to be an indication of laughter. We only tend to laugh at things that we think are real, which is interesting because if I know I can make you laugh at X, that tends to situate you in something. And then the question of also like good decision making, the connection with virtue and things like that. And so we've been talking about that. And in response to Mr. Jockin, because I always like this kind of point where we tend now to define the standard kind of according to the average as opposed to the excellence, right? And I also like the idea, if there's something about telling a joke that kind of situates where everybody is in the room, because they all laughed at that. And actually, I wanted to make the point, I have a good friend who does stand-up comedy, and he says one of the great mistakes people do is because they're funny with their friends, they think they can do stand-up comedy. And then they go on stage and it turns out that nobody laughs at them because they don't know the background. They don't have the same relations. They don't have the same experiences. So he's like, being able to do comedy on a stage with a bunch of strangers is very different from, say, doing it with your friends, right? And the point is that laughter suggests a certain relation or a certain set of experiences. And so when you can make people laugh, that tends to give you an indication that they are occupying a similar terrain. What's interesting is that then a joke would kind of give you a sense of the average, like what is the average experience that all these people have, but it would require you as telling the joke to take a risk. Right? You have to put yourself out there. You have to be able to sense the room, as opposed to the statistician. They don't have to take any risk at all. They just have to quantify, gather the data and say, oh, the means is X. But if I want to actually kind of it's almost like the difference between quantification average and almost a quality average. Like if I can make everyone laugh, I have a kind of a sense of a quality of experience that everyone has, that then kind of suggests, oh, we do have a kind of community here and maybe we can relate. And then the question that I come up with here is when you have a philosopher then that can make people laugh, that then tends to be evidence that this is a true philosophical problem then. Because the majority of people throughout all of their random situations or conditions that they've been in just instinctually laugh at something. Oh, this is probably a real philosophical point then. Because all of these people are laughing from in their own accidental conditions, and therefore laughter in the joke could perhaps be a lovely heuristic to determine which philosophies are actually getting at something, as opposed to which philosophies might just be abstract systems building. So that would also go, because I was just taken with Mr. Rollins, and then I'll give it to Chetan. I was taken with Mr. Rollins, this emphasis on kind of skill in arts and finding the right language and the right environment. And in some places you use X language and that alienates everyone. And then other people use Y language and not. And it's almost like the joke has a kind of function, because how do you tell what philosophical points have a higher likelihood of referring to something versus not? It's quite difficult. Well, if to a crowd of a whole bunch of people you don't know, there's a kind of laughter, then there's an instinctual recognition of a certain epistemological failure or quandary or ambiguity that a whole lot of people may resonate with. Therefore, there might be a good reason to think that philosophy that kind of centers that, orbits that, might actually be situated or helping locate the actual human condition. But let me give it to Chetan here. And again, Mr. Coach, it's lovely to see you today. Chetan, please.
I just want to sort of point out this dimension of comedy in that sense. Comedy is very interesting, and it always has to be in the moment genuine, because it cannot be completely pre-planned. No matter how much planning you do, and if you ask any stand comic, he'll tell you that no matter how much planning you do not know whether a joke will land or not. That has to be decided in that moment itself. And I'm wondering about the distinction between, say, Hannah Arendt makes in Work and Action in her book, The Human Condition. And she's arguing that modern politics is such where we are replacing action for work. Work, she argues, is something that can be completely pre-planned, something for which you can have a straight-jacketed model, something which can exist without contradictions in that sense, something whose end you already know. If you look at how you look at it, design a constitution, or laws in today's world, they are a form of work. They are a form of a complete sort of, a complete craft that you already have drawn, which would then be applied in that sense. And she's arguing that there is something about action that it cannot be conformed to this form of activity in that sense. Action is an activity of fundamentally different nature than this. If you think about comedy functions something of this nature, something of this kind. Comedy cannot be confined to this, that you have an imagination of a model which is perfect. You go, you execute. There's something about laughter that fails this exercise. Laughter or comedy always exists within the domain that you have to go, put yourself at risk of cracking a joke, looking completely stupid, and somebody laughs at it. And because somebody laughs at it, the joke suddenly becomes good. There's no other reason for it to be good at the end of it. There is something. Consequences for modern philosophy also, because as Aaron sort of points out, that philosophy actually emerged, if you look at Plato's cave allegory, it is an allegory where the philosopher has to go out of the world, make this perfect model, and then come and apply this model onto the world. That is how Plato sort of thought relationship in philosophy and politics. And since then, philosophy's role with politics was always something that it had to do outside of the political domain and then inform the politics. It was not something that happened within the political domain itself. Like comedy. And how do we think about that challenge of doing comedy in that sense, and then doing politics and doing philosophy in our times?
Interesting. I'm going to give it to Mr. Hunter Coates. We do have a storm that's coming up. So if for some reason I get knocked out, just jump back. And I'm now wondering, so first off, that's really interesting with the idea of genuineness also comes out in comedy. It has to be live. It has to be genuine. So maybe it's a highly likelihood of being a true discernment. There's also now things about risk. Mr. Ebert has talked about status anxiety and overcoming, like being willing to kill your status. And all these things are kind of emphasized in comedy. I'm now wondering if there's a difference between comedy and mockery, where maybe mockery is where you're trying to take down the state, but actually you might still be operating according to the principles of the state. And so you're actually still kind of within the system. And it looks like I'm getting frozen up, of course. That's what happens.
I'll go ahead and say it. This is a perfect tie-in.
Yeah, go on, Mr. Coates. I got froze.
Oh, look who's back.
This is perfect. So I was going to say is that comedy is always like a opening to the real. And we just experienced the real. Rose just cut out, and all of a sudden we're having our symbolic conversation. We're in this clear articulation. All of a sudden the real breaks in, Rose cuts out, the storm hits, and we all burst out laughing, right? We find it very funny. And I think that this kind of just ties into comedy in general. It's always kind of this invasion of the real. I mean, we try and overcode this real with a sense of political correctness, as Zizek has talked about many times. Something always gets lost in the comedy, right? We always feel that we're missing this level of comedy that we once had, right? And perhaps that's true. But at the same time, I think that it's just always this opening to the real that comedy prohibits, that comedy gives us. And if we try to take that away, we lose comedy as central. So...
That's a lovely comment. And that's an example of live, genuine thinking on the feet, decision-making. Very good. Excellent. Well done, Mr. Coates. I was going to say, what's interesting is, so there's something like you're saying where comedy is kind of a reminder. It kind of works. If there's the real, there it's there. So there's a feeling of genuineness. There's a feeling of risk. Mr. Ebert has talked about status anxiety, like killing your status, facing all of those different things. And I also wanted to note, I wonder if, do conspiracy theorists have good senses of comedy? Or do they actually just mock? I'm wondering, too, if there's a difference between comedy and mockery, where in a funny way, mockery may actually keep you in service of the system because you're actually mocking the big brother to acknowledge you, where comedy is you're like, oh, there is no big other. There's almost like a different kind of disposition. Maybe there's a difference between mockery and comedy. And that therefore mockery also doesn't, I want to talk about almost Oscar Wilde wit. There seems to be a difference in wit. There's something about wit that seems important. But let me pass it to Mr. Javier Rivera, unless you still had something to say, Mr. Coach, with your hand up, feel free. But I really please. Yeah,
I was just going to mention that we can look at Hegel's description of irony and phenomenology of spirit, where he says that it's like this lesser form of comedy, it's this lesser form of articulation of the spirit than something that's poetry or I think poetry comes after. But yeah, so I think that definitely comedy. There's something about it that we're drawn to, and it's different than irony, because irony would just be sort of a capitulation to the big other. But yeah, that's all I want to say. So
that's nice. So a difference between like comedy and irony, and actually no, that's a good way to put it. And I'll give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. And yeah, there is something about where and then I wonder how it aligns with the work labor politics distinction that Chitan is bringing up. Like, what is where does irony fall in that versus comedy? Because I think it's an interesting. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, I hope you don't have a massive storm out there in Arizona or wherever.
Yeah, no, I don't. So I have this question, right? So who's the heckler in the comedy skits, right? Or when the comic is talking and then there's a heckler that sort of interrupts him. Do we call this the real in some sense? Is this possibly the real? Where the comic has to sort of handle and sort of manage the real in some sense and bounce back with his own reply and you know, get back to a joke. I really like the idea of audience work where there's some comics that really kind of do most of their jokes with just audience work, right? They start picking out people in the audience who are like, so what do you do for a living, right? Or, you know, if a heckler happens, they're like, oh, okay, she's drunk, you know, like they find some type of way to play with the surprise. That's what I feel like a good comic always does. They know how to manage the surprise. Now, how does that relate to epistemological failure? Well, epistemological failure is really a surprise. And this is why I like the fact that before epistemological failure, we have to kind of be so trusting of something. And then it being like, oh, now I look like an idiot, right? But then it's kind of funny because somebody else pointed out to you. But like Chitan says, you can't like pre-plan this. It really does have to be like a kind of genuine surprise. What I've noticed about good comics is that even when a joke fails, they find some way to manage that failure. So there is something about that really makes me wonder about, you know, how we can study comedy in the course of history. You know, because if you look at old jokes like in the past, you might not even find them funny. So there is something about comedy revealing epistemological and philosophical problems that were actually important during a specific time period. But then there's also problems that you can pinpoint with comedy that just seem to be universal in general. Like gender. Gender is always one. Dick jokes always one. Like it's always gonna be like beyond history. A dick joke is always gonna be funny, basically. But it's just the way you say it now in the context of history. So there's a lot to go here and explore, in my opinion.
So there's a few things. Now I'm wondering, like, I want to go through almost like the Bible and all the holy texts and find out when God laughs, like when Jesus laughs, when God laughs, like what, you know, because you have parts in the Psalms where like God dances in the clouds. I'm wondering if there's something there, as just a side note. Second, it's very interesting that in Shakespeare, the jester is always the wise one. They have like the greatest insight. And it's almost like the revelation of the real, in order to handle it, has to be in a comic or form that you can dismiss, because otherwise it would be like God unveiling himself too much in Dante and thus reducing Dante to ash, right? Like it has to, like the comedy is a way of a kind of bringing forth a little bit of the real without being overwhelmed, and then doing it in a man, and then precisely its connection with the real might be evidence when you have these philosophers who are funny, that they're actually locating some kind of encounter of the real that a lot of people have had. So you're situating people in their actual human condition. And then I am curious if there's like my experience of like conspiracy theorists, just in reference to Mr. Coates' work on like QAnon, different things, like comedy's not allowed actually. Like mockery's allowed, but if someone in there is funny, then they might actually unveil that the structure is trying to avoid something. So you can allow mockery of the big other, but you can't have a witty person in your freaking conspiracy. Because what if that person like ruins the conspiracy? And then actually that's also been my experience in like fundamental religion or like hardcore political positions. You can have mockery, you can have dismissal, you can have kind of sarcasm, but you can't have real comedy, because comedy works with a certain kind of breaking apart of the internally consistent some system to show, hey, aren't we all just fooling ourselves? Hey, aren't we all just kind of scared of the unknown, and that's why we're in this political project? So it's interesting, the difference, and now I'll give it to Mr. Coates, on the difference between possibly where comedy is allowed, where it's not allowed, and where it's not allowed, how you are allowed to, say, engage in mockery or sarcasm or things like that, because that's not a threat to the internally consistent system or ideology that you're in that might undermine it. But let me give it to Mr. Hunter Coates.
Yeah. So building on that, one thing I've noticed a lot is that a lot of conspiratorial circles, they value the notion of irony more than comedy, because irony allows them to adopt positions, but not fully adopt them, right? They can make a joke about like, oh, what if this was true, right? So they can get people into it. They can say the idea they really believe, but they act like they don't believe it. And people that hear it have this plausible deniability as well. So both sides have a plausible deniability with the use of irony. But with comedy, it's much, much less plausible deniability available, because you're adopting this position. You're putting yourself out in the open, like the heckler that I think Javier mentioned. If you're a heckler at a comedy show and someone and you're talking to the comedian and you call out, the comedian looks right at you. He's on the stage. He sees you immediately. There is no hiding, right? But if you're a conspiracy theorist, conspiratorial subject, I want to use my term, you can shield yourself with the veil of irony to try and hide your real position and to try and bring others into your position. So
that's a lovely insight, and it makes me think, I think there is indeed the kind of postmodern irony is this kind of distancing, whereas like sometimes I'll talk about like a literary irony kind of going back is where you do X trying to get Y, and because you do X you don't get Y. Like that's kind of the deeper literary irony, but now there's this kind of distancing, and that's actually the tragic human condition that you're pointing out, that the irony of human beings is we try to do something, and that very means we try to do it, keep it from us. But then there's this perverted irony that's this kind of distancing, so that then we don't have to change. You know, no Wilka poem can come through and say, you must change your life. And I'm like, oh, yeah, when do statues start to talk? Oh, so then I don't have to change my life. But let me give it to Mr. Highroot. And now I'm wondering, so now I will say, you know, there's all this talk about how we're all going to die. You know, meta crisis, you know, choose your own apocalypse adventure. Oh, and by the way, I will note Mr. Peter Rollins gave us the greatest motivational poster of all time and telling us the apocalypse has already happened. It's already happened because you were born. So the apocalypse can't happen. Go live your life. There's nothing to worry about. Great phrase. But the idea is like the meta crisis, all these different people bring this sort of like somber seriousness. And it's funny to think that that might be the exact opposite of what we need. What we actually need is something more akin to wit, comedy, to show us epistemic failures, to let the real come into more tune at it. Like there's something about a seriousness that almost can be as distancing as the irony, because you're not involved in it. In fact, you're the problem solver that's going to solve it. I'll have to think on that, but there's something there that I'll have to consider. But Mr. Fishman, it's good to see you. I hope you're doing well.
Good to see you too. I am doing well. I would just pose a question here, which I don't have the answer to. I'm wondering what you guys think about it, which is like, why not make the Jester king, right? Like if comedy has this power to reveal the real and to sort of like get underneath our pretenses, and if the Jester has this ability to sort of like get to the heart of things, then why don't we give him power, right? Why don't we make him king? It seems like the comedian's ability to make jokes is predicated on his inability to enforce his statements, right? It seems like the jokes that a comedian makes wouldn't be so funny if a politician made them, right? Because then they might actually have consequences. And so I guess that would be my question, is like, what is the relationship between comedy and power and like influence and things like that? That's all I have to say there.
Dang, that's a good question. Why not make the Jester king if he's got all the insight? What is like is there like some sort of intentional dialectical structure? It's like if someone who's like a comedian becomes president, you're like, nah, that's too much. And yet you need it. So why shouldn't the Jester be king? Very interesting. Let me give it to Mr. Thomas Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, I mean, actually, for some great thinker somewhere, I could have read a book somewhere. It brought this up. Maybe something about givens and releases. maybe that's the account. That's the whole pretense, is that comedy is meant to be a pressure release from the contradictions of a given society. I mean, that would, I don't know if I don't know if we happen to have someone who thought that, who made an account like that for social orders and dynamics. Maybe they want to give an opinion about that. Um, that's that note. And then I think the other note. I mean, by the way, we say we don't have gestures as leaders. We got actors. We got to that point. I don't know how much further we need to go to make a claim that this is actually in the realm of possibility. We might end up with one day. Just say. We'll leave it at that.
Now I love this idea that the problem with the actor is that they're like not enough of an actor, in the sense that if they were a jester, you would be like undeniable that they're an actor. But you have these politicians that they're all like, oh, they're acting, but they're in this kind of middle space where they're also too serious. And it's almost like that ambiguity creates all sort of kind of pathological responses to it. And the way, Mr. Coach and I were talking about ambiguity the other day. Yeah, no, with givens and releases, like the comic provides a certain release, so thank you for the reference, where you need releases, otherwise it's totalitarian. But if it's all release, you're existentially overwhelmed by possibility, so you need givens that you don't have to think about. But if there's too much givens, then you're oppressed and you enter into a kind of thoughtlessness that's very problematic. So comedy, it's interesting where the jester, the king always needs a jester, and the jester always needs a king. That the jester is directing toward. Because if the jester is the structure of release and there are no givens, then it's chaos. But then if there's a king who never has to like question themselves or let the reel in, or never has to not take themselves too seriously, well, then the king becomes very oppressive. So it's interesting that in that connection between the king and the jester, there must be a kind of dialectical relationship. Otherwise, in the same way, there has to be a dialectical between givens and releases. And then if givens can't come back, the question is, what is the negation sublation of givens in the world today? What does that even mean? And then we get into the address and drinking a lot of coffee. But this kind of question between the givens and releases, the jester and the king, is fascinating. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Hey, Javier Rivera, did the jester unveil the epistemological limitations of the king? So if they're the same one, they don't realize that or something?
So this is my answer to Fishman's question. Actually, the comic doesn't become king. He says he's king. He goes, "I'm the captain now." Okay, he goes, "I'm the captain now." Okay, even though really he has no authority, but he just goes, "I'm the captain now." Okay, but that would fit perfectly with the comic as king. That he doesn't become king. He just says, "Actually, guys, I'm the captain now." Okay. Right. And then because I mean, what I've noticed, and this kind of would already reveal the epistemological failure, is that the political realm is too serious by like in itself, right? It can't handle a comic as king. What it can handle is a comic claiming he's king. Right? That's the weird position of it. It can't handle that. It's because if a comic says he's king, he's the president now, it's funny, right? It's funny because he's not actually the president. But it almost seems to need to function that way, in a weird way. Because if he actually does become king, I think what ends up happening is the comic falls into the trap of what Chitan pointed out. That he starts doing work instead of action. And that he has to pre-plan things. And so now he's no longer funny. He's a serious man doing work. Right? And then you divide the man further to where his funny self can only be in this specific context. It can never be in the context of him ruling. So it for me, that the answer resides in him saying that he is king, rather than becoming king, actually. And I like that position because it makes me laugh, mainly. But yeah, that's it.
It's funny to think that if you have a Shakespeare play and the jester puts the crown on his head, then everyone would start to appreciate the fact that the king is serious. Like maybe people are like, "Serious, you're too friggin' serious." And the jester's like, "Okay, well, I'm king." And they're like, "Well, actually, maybe it's not so bad." Like there's a certain like, oh, kind of calling you out. Like, well, let's actually do it then. Let's actually see. Like, it's almost like Peter Rollins was saying, like a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't believe in demons or Satan or whatever." And then you pull out a Satan prayer and you say, "Well, then read this." And they're like, "No, I don't think I want to read that." In the same way that Mr. Coates and I were talking about, if someone says, hey, if I look at you and say, hey, would you run down the street in your underwear for $500? Everyone's like, of course I would do that. And then you pull out the $500, Mr. Coates would say, it's like, okay, go. And then suddenly you're like, I don't know about that. And so there's something interesting of where the jester may be saying, oh, okay, I'm king, would then make you actually appreciate the king, who sometimes may come across as too serious. But then on the flip side, if the king said, actually, I'm going to be the jester, then you'd be like, no, we don't want that. We actually can appreciate the jester kind of being separated. And maybe today, the problem is we don't have those clear distinctions, right? It feels like all the politicians are jesters, and it feels like the comedians are just working as opposed to engaging in action. So then what happens is there's a kind of ambiguity, and we're kind of lost in the middle of that, because instead, like, you haven't someone that's almost just kind of entertain the symbolic order in a way to make you face, oh, do you really want politicians to be actors? Because let's elect an actor and see what that does. Okay, no, I just wanted to say they were actors. I didn't want them to actually be actors, but now they've kind of become actors. We're literally voting for people who are celebrities and different things. So then it makes me think, and I'll give it to Chetan here, like, is there a problem with the entertainment industry, which then makes entertainment, wit, and all these kind of work, as opposed to us being entertaining as citizens in culture, in conversations with one another? Because if we're like entertaining with one another, then what we have is an action that can kind of function to an ability to function as a jester in the court to the king. And then you have a dialectical relation where now, if all entertainment and comedy is just a form of work as opposed to action, there's a blurring of all the categories that then doesn't have a useful dialectical function. That's a thought that comes to mind, but let me give it to Mr. Chetan. Chetan, please.
I think one of the things we need to say out is that if comedy can be, laughter can be used to bring the outside in, if it can be used to keep two contradictory facts together, it can also be used to keep yourself blocked from the outside. Its function also exists on the other side as much as it exists on this side, in that sense. A lot of times we use laughter to, you can look at it in bullying, you can look at it in a lot of such domains where laughter actually is used to block the outside, to ridicule the outside, and so on and so forth. I think that's one. I think the other is that there's a great power in comedy, to the extent that comedy allows you to bring people on your side. If somebody laughs with you, you bring that person on your side immediately, and you can look at that in various dimensions. And I think power, as far as power is, means to act in concert, to be able to find the potential to act in a manner where other people act with you. That is where power finds its home, in that sense, simply. To that degree, laughter can actually actualize a lot of power. You can look at that in, if you can make group of boys laugh at that odd kid, you can make the same group of boys activate a lot of violence on that kid also. It's always possible. If 5 people can laugh on that odd person, 5 people can also at some moment be actualized for some violence upon that. There is that haunting horror dimension to laughter in that sense. The other thing I think with laughter and comedy is, which I think we need to think about, is there's a very interesting film called I think Article 15, which is released in Indian, and it made a very interesting point. And the movie is reasonably ordinary film on caste. Like, you have race in US, we have like big issue of caste in India, and the movie ended with what happened. It was trying to make a point that somebody asked this woman sitting on the street, what is her caste? Essentially asking somebody their caste is a casteist thing. But what happened in the movie ending is, when that question is asked, everybody starts laughing. And the point we're trying to make was that you cannot overcome caste by not talking about it. You can only overcome caste when you can resituate it or replace it in the domain of, comedy, or in the domain of, laughter. It's only when you can finally laugh about it that you have actually made some. And you can look at that same question in the cases of gender. You can look at the cases of, till the point where we're very serious about those discussions and those topics. If we crack a joke upon certain gender issue, you immediately will somebody, oh, you're being, patriarchal, you're being sexist, you're being, you hate women, or you're anti-LGBTQ, whatever. It's only when those jokes start becoming again accepted within those discussions that that you've made some progress within those movements. So these are, I think, the two sides of relationship between politics and laughter that we need to, I think about in some senses.
That's a very interesting comment, and I should note that Mr. Cadell Last put Zupanch's book in there that I didn't know about. That looks fascinating. And there was also a Henry Bergson book on comedy and laughter, but I don't remember any of it because it wasn't very funny. But there might be stuff there as well. I'm really interested. So there's two things. First off, I wonder if we make a distinction between mockery and comedy, or maybe irony and comedy. There's different ways to language this. It's almost like mockery places the lack outside of you, or the problem outside of you, where comedy brings it inside and you see it as part of us. And actually, that's an empowering move, because then you can't be susceptible to some politician promising you to escape that problem that you located outside of. Once you say, no, actually, we actually create these situations for ourselves regarding caste or the human condition. Isn't that kind of funny? And actually, we can get a kind of power over it and actually be empowered by recognizing that the lack is not external from us, but actually internal from us. So now we can stop struggling against it. And how funny, there's almost something funny in the idea that you overcome a problem by ceasing to fight it, by actually embracing it. There's something almost kind of comic about, oh, we tried so hard, and actually all we had to do was stop. Like one of those kind of thumb things where you get your, like the Chinese finger thing where you pull them and then you go in and you get out. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, I'm really interested by this idea, Chetan, of almost the metric of a successful enterprise of dialogue or political enactment or project is laughter. Like if you're trying to say, what is the sign, like you brought up with Peter Rollins, which I thought was very good, is kind of this idea of this problem of the language problem, right? Like wrestling with language. And he was also noting like how you find the right language in Christian circles to kind of fit in, not alienating. You have to play this different things. What is the metric by which you might determine that you've successfully engaged in the meta skill, as I've talked about, like of that kind of meta language? The fact that if at the end everyone laughs, well, that's a very tangible kind of metric. If you actually get there, then there would be reason to think that you've carried out this enterprise well. If you don't get there, there might still be work to do. So that's not to say it's a perfect metric, but it's interesting how there's something about the laugh that's an indication that something is being done right, as long as it is not pointed outward. If it's pointed outward, maybe you're unified by a Girardian scapegoat or something like that, or some sort of notion of a big other that you're going to take down. But if it's inward, then the laugh of the inward might be an indication that one has engaged in thought, or is engaging in real action, or engaging in a successful working through language to get at what actually needs to have a unified ground. So I like this idea. And then it's instinctual. What's funny about it, you're not asking, hey, do we think we found a good language? People will, oh, yeah. But that's not going to do it. You want that instinctual, just people laugh. They don't have to put in the rational. It's like a non-rational sort of consent that would give a reason to think that it might be stronger. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera.
What you're talking about, Daniel, this discrepancy between language and jokes. I like puns because puns are a perfect example of this discrepancy, that it plays on language and it also plays on objects of knowledge that we know. But what's ironic about this is that if the language is already inaccessible, the joke can't be funny. So, for example, you can't say the same pun in Spanish because it just wouldn't work. It has to be in English because that's part of the pun. It plays off of the English language. You can't say it in Spanish because there's no Spanish word that directly corresponds. No Spanish word that directly corresponds to the English word. So there is something there about using language and the discrepancy of language between the object of knowledge to make a pun, right? That you have to assume in some sense that the subject is already in the language to make the pun work in some sense, right? But if you say an English pun to a Spanish-speaking crowd, I mean, they may find it funny if they speak English, but again, we may not find the Spanish puns as funny because again, it's not our intimate immersion with that language, we may not find it as funny. Like, there's a perfect example of my mother when she was it's such a funny example, but my mother was studying for her master's degree in nursing, and I remember I was little, and she was really frustrated with online classes, and she threw the mouse because suddenly it stopped working, and she threw it at the wall, and she goes, "Damn computa," right? And so this play, what she did was she made a play on computer and the word bitch, which is puta. And so she combined the word computer and bitch at the same time, and she said, "Damn computa." And it was funny as shit to me as a kid, because it's like, I understand the English word computer, and I also understand the word bitch in Spanish, and it's fucking hilarious that she did that. It's hilarious that she combined the two words, threw the mouse, and said, "Damn computa." You know? Like, she brilliantly found a way to call the computer a bitch in one word. You know? So again, without that discrepancy, without me knowing the language, I wouldn't have found it as funny. And it's definitely difficult to make other people realize how funny it is if you don't have an understanding of the Spanish language, you know. So I'll leave it there.
It's very interesting to think that comedy requires a mutual participation in a symbolic order, where if you don't participate and you don't get it. Also, please, I can't wait till your mom, like at her birthday, is like, "Javier, what's one of your favorite childhood memories?" And you're like, "Actually, I remember one really good." So that's quite funny. It's also interesting to me, like, I think about people like Oscar Wilde, for example, with the aphorism or that kind of wit, or Chesterton, right? Like when Chesterton, I was speaking with Matthew Stanley, where Chesterton has that magnificent line where he says, "The poet is someone who's trying to get their head in the clouds, where the madman is someone who's trying to get the cloud in their heads." And he's talking about the pure philosopher rationalist, right? And everyone laughed. Everyone kind of smiled, right? And yet that smile also is indication of that's really succinct, that's really well worded, and it's getting at something true. So someone has kind of mastered a symbolic order to point at the real, and we say, "Oh, that's good," because you're not supposed to do that with the symbolic. The symbolic's supposed to hide the real, and you actually just used it toward it, because the philosopher is trying to get the clouds in their head, where the poet has their heads in the clouds, and we tend to mock the person that puts their head in the clouds. But Mr. Chesterton is suggesting, no, that person's got it really funny, where Oscar Wilde is like, a friend is someone who stabs you in the front. A friend is someone who stabs you in the front, right? And it's like, oh, okay. Where it's like, there's this play where you're taking something like an enemy stabs you in the back. It's like, oh, well, a friend would stab you in the front, right? Basically, and then the question, what's interesting about that is that, does that tell you what a friend is? Does that tell you, like, maybe it tells you what a fake friend is, right? Or what most people's idea of a friend is. And they're not really that much better than an enemy. All they do is stab you from the front, right? But there's some intuition of a symbolic order that is being complexified in that aphorism. In the same way that when Chesterton uses his line, there's a complexification of the social order, but not in a way. It's almost like if Chesterton were to give you like a hard philosophical thesis on how to not get the clouds in your head, it wouldn't work. But it's precisely by leaving an open space for you to decide how you respond to that then there's a joke and, oh, that's really good. And then there's laughter from an embarrassment of, oh, crap, I need to do something now. I need to change how I live my life or something. So there might be something there. The other question that I have, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak as we come up. I will have to go in about 28 minutes, so about 5:30. But this is, I appreciate everyone here today. I wonder if you can be free without comedy. Is it possible to be free without comedy? Can you make good choices if you can't be funny? To kind of allude to some of the stuff that Javier has been saying, because if you can't engage in comedy, then you can't be free relative to kind of coming to terms with the inherent lack or finitude of the human condition, right? If you're just mocking, can you be free? Because you're suggesting there's something external that's keeping you from your freedom. So that doesn't seem to work. And also, without comedy, you might be taking yourself too seriously to be free, right? So is it possible to be free without comedy? I don't know. That's an open question. And then if you can't be so free, can you make good decisions without comedy? Because you might not be able to tell the difference between something that's actually correctly identifying the world. You might not be accurately situated in your condition. Is there something about actually learning how to engage in comedy that makes you a better decision maker and that makes you more free? Maybe, maybe not. I was speaking earlier how I think one of the roles of the humanities is actually to train you to make quality decisions in ambiguous situations, where it's not clear who's right and wrong. But if you're trying to judge what Hamlet should do or not, or Achilles, or we can get into some of Flannery O'Connor or something, you have to make quality decisions according to different principles of what's the good that is not self-evident. So there's a way in which the humanities may train us in terms of quality decision. So I'm now wondering if there's something about freedom and comedy that's linked together. And indeed, it would seem like, to Mr. Coates' point, the person who can only be ironic is not free. They're not free in a sense. All they can do is distance themselves. So they're almost like a slave to their needing to distance themselves from situations. So I'm wondering if there's some relation potentially between comedy and freedom, and then comedy, ergo by extension, comedy and decision-making. But that's just one question I have, but anyone can speak on anything. Mr. Cadell Last, please.
Yeah, this is a fascinating discussion. I've been thinking a lot about like the role of comedy in my life. So there's an example I want to give between, so I was participating in a lot of men's work during coronavirus. And there was the head of the European Men's Organization. His name's Paul Robson, and we would always go to his house for organizations and stuff like that. And he's very serious. And we'd always bring a crew with us, and one of the guys in our crew was Thomas Hamilton, and he was a jester, right? So you have Paul who's being the king and Thomas who's being the jester. Okay, and now I have an affinity for Thomas. I have a personal affinity for Thomas over Paul, but I can see from Paul's perspective how annoying Thomas was. Because Paul's setting up this big event, he's putting in a lot of work, he's hosting us at his house, he's putting all of his time and energy into this, and then Thomas just gets drunk and makes a fucking joke of the whole thing, right? Like, so, you know, like I had a lot of mixed feelings about that whole dynamic, and like, and I always have this personal, you know, is like. So within that context, what I tried to do to diffuse that tension was I tried to make jokes which served the structure as opposed to making jokes which were bringing down the structure. So like Thomas was getting drunk to bring down the structure. Like he was getting drunk and acting a fool to purposely disrupt everything so things didn't go right. So like, I don't know. It's a difficult one. It's a difficult one to understand the relationship between those two, and especially on the position of the king, so to speak. I think the best thing to do is almost pretend like the powerful king, I think, lets the jester do their thing. Like doesn't put up too much resistance, I think the weak king would put up resistance to the jester. Like try and get rid of the jester, try to exclude the jester. And I think the powerful jester is doing what he can to serve the betterment of the structure, not to just be disruptive, purely disruptive. So if there can be a relationship between those two elements, I think they're both integral.
I think that's a fantastic comedy. I think it's a fantastic comment. And it makes me think that we know that there's good leadership and bad leadership, for example, right? We know there are good kings and there's bad kings, but we don't have as good of a grip on a good jester and a bad jester. But there does seem to be a skill there that's different. Like when we compare like they talk like Jane Austen, and you see in her novels so much wit. Like there's this kind of witness that's really smart, but it's very pointed and it's kind of comedy, which seems very different from, say, maybe the outlandish Hollywood movies you might see, right? Like there's a kind of wit comedy, there's a kind of discerning comedy, and then there's a kind of mockery that isn't necessarily constructive, and yet that doesn't mean all comedy is bad. There's a certain kind of comedy that without the king gets in trouble. And there's something about the wise king also knows that he or she, you know, as a queen, cannot be serious without comedy. Because actually without comedy, you're probably stuck in a framework and you're not taking the problem seriously because you're only thinking about it one way. So there's a way in which you can't be serious without comedy, but then at the same time, true comedy takes itself seriously. But like the jester's like, I'm doing a really important role, so I better do it really well. And that kind of like seriousness and they come together. Please, Cadell.
I just want to say one more thing I thought was a funny joke between Paul and Thomas, and then I'll pass it to is Paul thought our situation is hopeful but serious. And Thomas thought our situation is hopeless but not serious. So I just thought that was perfect. That was like
I love that. I'll give it to Javier. And there's something about needing both of those sentiments and living in both of those sentiments at all times, constantly, never getting too much on one side, too much on the other. But of course, maintaining the bothness, there's only one way to do that: quality decision. The ability to make the decision of when you're going to one side versus the other. So how do we make better choices? How do we make better weighing? And how do we be honest with ourselves to tell if we're getting too far to one side versus the other? I love that contrast there, Cadell. Thank you. I'll give it to Javier and then Chetan, please.
So in this case, I will take an ironic position for the good king and the good jester, mainly because I would like to point this out. I think the good comic reveals how serious it is, right? And the king reveals how funny it is by being serious, right? So by being serious, it reveals how funny it is. And the comic, by being funny, reveals how serious it is. But there is something about that is circulating around the epistemological failure, which is that it seems like here, if the epistemological failure isn't, I guess, communal in some sense, right? Then it becomes a kind of effacement, right? And I think that's probably one of the most difficult work with comics, is that they know the epistemological failure, but they're trying to work around how to make it funny for even the person that takes it seriously. How do you make it funny for somebody that takes it so serious? That is like a real problem. And so, just an anecdote. There's a girl that I've been talking to, and she watched the last net session, Daniel. And she's like, I'm so confused by what you philosophers mean by violence. Because even Chetan was like, yeah, non-violence is violence, and so on and so on, right? And so we had this moment at work where I made this joke, and I did something. I was like, yeah, I'm just so violent. And she started laughing. She just started laughing at it, right? Because she couldn't understand our definition of violence, right? It wasn't any like formal definition. But ever since then, I've just been making jokes. I just do random gestures. I'm like, because I'm so violent. Right. And then she now finds it funny, basically. But that to me already shows the epistemological failure of the fact that we never defined violence really in the most like succinct fashion. It remained ambiguous, it remained general. But it was funny to her because she didn't understand. And yet I was including her in it, right? I was playing along with her attack on the fact that we never defined violence in a very formal way. And so she found it really funny. But that's just a side note. I'm finished there.
And there's no need to thank us for providing that ambiguous space where you could commune with the opposite sex. There's no need to thank us. That was a real delight. So no, it's very interesting as well, because in that, but you see that response to the ability to watch, to not understand, but then able to laugh, there's something that's kind of good about that, right? As opposed to just going, oh, that's stupid, and being like, oh, dumb, it's your fault, you should have done it, right? So there's a kind of choice of the response to the situation. I'm now wondering, and then I'll pass it to Chetan and then Mr. Hirut. It would seem like there's a difference when you say, I'm interested with the epistemic failure. So when you mock, you say you're failing. In comedy, there's we're failing. So there's a kind of isolation and mockery potentially of the failure to the other, where perhaps in comedy, then we are incomplete together. So you're locating in like a communal failure as opposed to an ostracizing failure, which then in that ostracization, you're suggesting you're perfect because you can judge who's failing and who's not. So it's interesting to think of that difference. But let me give it to Chetan and Mr. Fissman, please.
I think I just want to sort of come back to the discussion between laughter and power, and underneath this discussion between king and jester also lies that dynamic that power has with laughter in that sense. In India, we have these very interesting stories called Akbar Birbal ki Kahaniyan, Akbar Birbal stories, where Akbar is the king and Birbal sort of plays the role of the jester. And you would get stories of the kind where Akbar sort of puts a reward upon a person who can stand, naked in a cold night. And once a person stands in the cold night, next day, he's called and he's asked that, how did you stand? He said, I was looking at a light bulb far away. And Akbar sort of dismissed that person. He said, you'll not get the reward because you're taking the heat from that bulb. And Birbal next day went to cook Akbar's food. And he put the pot on the top of the ceiling and the fire on the... and he said, let's see how much time it takes to heat that. Akbar comes in, he says, the food can't be cooked. And it is there that realization happens where, why that person should be rewarded. I think there is something, these kind of stories are something interesting that they hide within themselves, which is that no matter how powerful and how strong the king is, the king can be made weak very fast. A king can lose his power very quickly for a variety of reasons. And king cannot function in a dynamic of one against all. There's a very false notion of king. King is a monarch. It's not actually. King simply cannot function within the dynamic where he is isolated against the whole in that sense. And that power dynamic has to be always balanced and maintained by something like a jester in between, which can disrupt things enough such that things may not ever tilt in the direction of king completely. It will never be all against one. But at least it should never become one against all. That is where something like laughter always plays its role within the dynamics of the king. Which has to be, I think, somewhere uncovered in dynamic of laughter and power. Maybe we can say more about thinking of power and violence vis-a-vis laughter, later. But I think something about this has to be thought through.
That's interesting to suggest that without a jester, there's not power. Maybe there's just kind of force or something, where power, like the laughter, actually suggests some sort of organizing principle that is at work. That's a very interesting comment. Let me give it to Mr. Fishman, then Cadell. Mr. Fishman.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking through this whole idea of like the good jester versus the bad jester that Cadell brought up, and I mean I'm just thinking out loud here, but in today's world, we have all these comedians that have become like newscasters, right? And I feel like we turn to the comedians because the newscasters became so corrupt and so absorbed within their own kind of symbolic framework that they couldn't tell us the real story. You know what I mean? And so we had to turn to the comedians to give us some sort of reality. But now it seems like the comedians have become political, and as soon as they do, they stop being funny, and two, we lose all trust, right? Because it's like, wait a minute, you weren't a good newscaster to begin with. We were just turning to you because you would at least tell us what you thought was the truth. But now if you're not even going to do that, then what's the point, right? And so there's a sense in which, like, yes, I agree with Cadell that like the good jester is ultimately at the service of the king, but it's like if you do that too much, then it undermines the whole thing and you're not really a jester anymore. You're just another political agent, right? And so I think ultimately, like, I don't know, now that I say that, like, I don't think the jester is in service of the king. I think the jester is in service of the laugh, like, period. You know what I mean? I feel like a true comedian is just trying to say whatever will get the biggest laugh from the audience, period. And if it helps the kingdom, good. If not, maybe not. But I guess, like, there is, coming back to this idea of mockery, I do think there are comedians who will try and tell jokes at the expense of one person to make them feel bad. And there's other comedians who will tell jokes to include everybody. And I guess that's how it is at the service of the king, right? Like if the comedian can tell a joke about the king and the king laughs along with everybody else, then it humanizes the king and it builds camaraderie between the king and his subjects, right? Whereas if the comedian tells a joke to tear the king down, then like either the king gets mad and kills the jester, in which case he comes off as a tyrant, or he just like succumbs to the shame, in which case he seems weak, right? So I do think, as you guys were saying, I think like mockery versus a kind of inclusive comedy that humanizes people is the distinction. And then like I know we're coming up to the close, but like Daniel said something like 30 minutes ago about how like does God laugh, right? Which to me is such an interesting question. And this is something I heard Cornell West said this on the Joe Rogan podcast. And he was quoting somebody else. I think he was quoting G.K. Chesterton maybe. But he goes, Socrates never cried and Jesus never laughed. And I was like, whoa, you know? And so like, what is the significance there? Because crying and laughter are two ways in which we break our kind of current symbolic framework, right? But one is like crying is you're overcome by the seriousness of the situation such that your current frame can't handle it. And laughter, it's like you're overcome by the silliness of the situation such that your current frame can't handle it, right? And like what is it about Jesus as like the logos made flesh, right? That just like can't take the silliness. And what is it about Socrates as this kind of like pure rationality that can't take the serious of crying? So I don't know, that might open up a whole different can of worms, but that's what I have to say right now.
Well, that's fascinating. Because like, so that's what I was saying. I was like, I can't remember where Jesus laughs in the gospel. And now it's like, I don't think he does. And so if we go to this kind of ancient Catholic tendency to say Socrates and Jesus are two sides of like this same revelation, that's been a move from like an Aquinas where you get like reason from Socrates and revelation from Jesus. Almost there is that one has something that the other lacks and that you need them both, or else revelation is not reasonable, or reason eats itself because it doesn't have revelation. That's very interesting. Mr. West is on it there. I'm also, the point you brought up about the like Jon Stewart and all these different things, it makes me think of the problem where a Christian writer that is directly Christian fails, even though the church is like happy, yay, you're explicitly Christian. But explicitly Christian turns into like propaganda. What actually ends up, say, like serving the church better is someone like a Dostoevsky or Flannery O'Connor who is not explicitly Christian, and they're just trying to make good art. And funny enough, in just trying to make good art, it actually serves the entire social order in a manner that actually helps it, and it's more healthy. But when it tries to be explicitly religious, then it actually can fail. And I think you like Jon Stewart and them, like when people stopped believing that they weren't, say, liberal, like people were like, oh, they're just liberal. That's what happened with Jon Stewart, right? It then felt like it was it was serving a political order. So it lost the ability to actually, in a sense, serve the king by serving the people in a manner that actually made them governable. So there's this interesting thing about the jester is best in serving the king when they're not trying to serve the king. And the same way that the artist is best when they just try to be a great artist and then they point to something transcendent. There's some kind of strange kind of paradox there that comes to mind. But let me give it to Cadell Last and Mr. Hunter Coates.
The background I've been trying to think throughout the conversation is this weird relationship that I have with Heideggerians, is that like the first thing is what I think is super interesting about the Freudian moment for philosophy is that he takes jokes seriously. So joke slips of the tongue, dreams. These are the royal road to the unconscious. But it's bringing this paradox of taking jokes seriously. Like Freud thought, like jokes are not just senseless. Jokes are actually intelligent. Jokes are actually telling you, sourcing important information from, if you like, the collective unconscious. And my thoughts are still scrambled on really what I'm trying to say, but what I want to bring it to is this weird paradox, because we've been talking about the king and the jester, is that when I was a kid, I remember being 5 and thinking, the king or the president or the prime minister must be the smartest person in the world. We must put the king or the president or there must be the smartest persons there. And then just growing up in a reality where Trump is president, for example, or, basically we have a situation where the jester is president, or we have a situation where the jester can become president. where a total buffoon can become president. And just what, like, to me, it is like, if we have a situation, I think Hairut was talking about, where I grew up watching also like Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart making fun of news and stuff, where we have the comedian who's making fun of news, and we get our news from a comedian. To me, this is, and also like Daniel, you were talking about Zizek being very funny and stuff. To me, if we're in a situation, paradoxically, if we don't take psychoanalysis seriously philosophically, we end up in a situation where society becomes a joke, where the presidents become jesters, where the newscasters become comedians, where the philosophers have to be funny to get the point across. So it's not necessarily, I don't think that the philosopher needs to be funny, because some people are just not funny. Some people are just clever, but they're not necessarily funny. I think if all of the serious institutions are led by jester-like figures, I'm just a hypothesis that means the institutions are dying, or that means something's coming to an end. Like, it's like a dangerous symptom. It's like, you don't want that. And that's what I think our situation is we're in a situation where the serious institutions are run by jesters, and this is a disaster situation.
Like, I guess Trotsky once said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Now I'm thinking about whatever we don't take seriously still takes us seriously. We may not have taken like comedy seriously, so comedy started taking us seriously, and now it's in control. Whereas Freud was like, well, what actually does this show, and to really kind of examine it. And maybe part of the issue is that the jester who tries to serve the king, you get a problem. But instead, it's that the jester just does their thing, and the king knows that he needs to honor the jester and pay attention to the jester as the jester does their thing. In the same way that the jester knows that he should acknowledge the king as the king does their thing. So it's this thing where there's not an intentional serving, but the other knowing that they should acknowledge the other as they do their thing. Otherwise, like you said, Mr. Hairut, they can like try to do the other and serve, and then it all falls apart. It's really interesting because this kind of speaks to like the skill of the artist in doing the thing. But
so I want to go back to the ethics of the comedy and the relation between the king and the jester and the kingdom or society, structures, whatever the case. I feel like, Hairut made a really good point, because it seems like the only way you can discern propaganda from actual comedy is that it has to be pointing out the epistemological failure, where propaganda wants to sort of cover over that epistemological failure, right? It wants to sell you something that's not necessarily, it's selling you to maintain the structure, whereas the epistemological failure actually shows you where the structure fails in that case, right? And so this is where Cadell's point on like how we have jesters maintaining the sort of status order of things, I would call basically propaganda, right? They're wanting to hide the epistemological failure by saying, look, let's make this funny so that way we can maintain the structure of things. Whereas the risk with pointing out the real epistemological failure is that it could immediately overthrow the structure, right? Which is scary. This becomes the ethical question and the choice upon the jester, so to speak, where you have to make the choice of revealing the epistemological failure and dealing with that repercussions. Because actually, this can either result in a complete innovation of the structure, or a complete total collapse of the structure, right? A revolution, right? A protest or something like that. So I feel like if we center it on the question of, I think everything that everybody's made just, to me, makes more ambiguous what exactly is the epistemological failure. Because even propaganda can fool you into thinking that there is some type of epistemological failure, but it's not them. It's somebody else. It's this outside thing that is the epistemological failure. So we are going to maintain this because that is the epistemological failure. So we're going to distance ourselves from this. So it really does kind of raise this ambiguous question for me about what is exactly the epistemological failure that is revealed. Is it in the fact that everybody laughs, that we go, ha, there's the location of it, like that's where it might reside? Because then I'd have some concerns if only some people laugh and then nobody else laughs. And then I'm like, oh, okay. Shit. Okay, so yeah, I'll leave it there.
Fair enough. So I'll give it to Michelle and then Chetan. Maybe the epistemological failure is the failure to articulate the epistemological failure. Yeah. There you go. Like all you can do is laugh. Like laugh is a sign of the ambiguity. Like literally maybe the epistemological failure may be precisely the failure to put into epistemological terms what it is, because all you can do is laugh. Like all you can do is react to it. You can't necessarily articulate it maybe. But let me give it to Michelle and then Chetan. Michelle, please.
Hi guys, great to see you all. And I was thinking about how jokes it's really interesting because, and you touched on this right now, Javier, about like the scary element of joking. It's almost like when you joke with a friend, but then like one time you joked and you were joking, but they took it seriously or something, and like that then somebody's offended and it's hard. It's like, I think when you feel comfortable joking with somebody, you've like reached a platitude, you've reached some place in your relationship and friendship to be able to joke with each other. And like there's something that makes you at ease knowing you can joke around and the person's gonna get it, like they're gonna understand. Like I was thinking about this, like the idea that and this also speaks to what you said, Javier, about like the joke, you have to get it, right? Like Daniel will tell me, like, Michelle, if you have to explain the joke, like, or if I have to explain the joke, it's not funny. Like that wasn't the point of the joke. The point of it was that you got it, right? You get it. And so it's funny about how, like, we talk about like it and kind of the idea that there's something about it that joking really seems to point at. But this is also scary, right? Because jokes can also touch on some of our deepest insecurities, It's like that meme with like Dwight being like, he's laughing and he's crying and it's like, when the meme's funny, but it also touches your deepest insecurities. So it's like, there's something very, again, kind of, there's a threatening, like a violence to, there's a violence to language itself, right? But there's something inherently kind of, violent, but also in the playful sense. Like, why do kids like to play like, be a monster and chase me, or, hide and seek where somebody's gone and now they're here again. And like all this sort of thing is like this playful nature of like, of violence and jesting, and it's there's something quite like we enjoy that, but it's also like if you aren't quite comfortable knowing, like there's also people, we'll talk about people having a type of humor, right? Like, oh, I'm trying to gauge their sense of humor, I'm trying to do my alchemy, figuring out which meme they'll laugh at or something like that. Like, there's something about the fact that there seems to be something general about humor where like we'll all laugh, but there's also something very deeply personal and singular about somebody's humor, or just it's kind of like, oh, I know that person would laugh at this, or I think they would really like they'd get a kick out of that. And so I think it's also interesting that humor is one of the greatest forms of like, even to speak about memes and such things, like this becomes a universal language of like laughter and trying to connect with each other. And like, somebody could be all the way across the world, but we'll all laugh at some funny quotidian thing that we can all relate to, So that was just a general thing on that. But then I was thinking about epistemological failure. I think this is a great question about like, it's almost like which epistemological failure is the failure, because it reminds me of Hunter in your book, where you talk about like the fact that like conspiracy theorists are like, okay, yeah, no, we're questioning the other, but then they have their own other that they preserve with everything that they encounter, every failure. Oh, okay, well, the prediction of this thing that the conspiracy theory predicted didn't happen, but that's actually part of it. It always becomes just part of the internally consistent system. And so I think what's interesting is like this layering of otherness, right? The layers of failure. And I don't know. I guess the only thing that it makes me think of as like a potential answer is just humility. Like, maybe the conspiracy theorists actually could be right. I don't know. So I'm not going to just completely ostracize them or treat them differently. I might not believe everything that they say, but also I'm not going to believe everything that MSN, the news says, So I guess what I mean to say is like, yeah, I think it's really interesting on the question of like, what is the actual epistemological failure? But I think my only like I don't know, humility is just a thing that comes up in my mind. Also, when you and Hunter spoke, Daniel, where it's like, okay, it helped me a lot getting through the conspiracy phase of my own personal journey, where like I started to learn about conspiracies and I was like, oh my gosh, and then you get paranoid, like yes. And so the long and the short of it is like, what helped me in that and getting out of it was realizing that, like, why am I so certain about what these people are saying over here or what those people are saying over there? They might be right, they might be wrong, but I don't know, and I have to embrace the uncertainty. And what I can learn is that we have something that actually does unify us in the humor sense of what I said at the beginning, where we all kind of tend to do this thing, whether, you know, and like this is what Hunter and you spoke about, Daniel, where like everybody's actually conspiratorial. You know, we just, when you realize it, at least you have an awareness that helps you to undo your certainty. And that's humility. That's what humility will do. And I think that goes a long way in being able to just exist in this world and do, like, be able to live in a better way with those around us, with ourselves, is to get humble and to embrace uncertainty. So that's all I want to add. But thank you all so much.
No, that's a wonderful comment. I'll give it to Chitan. I like this kind of idea that, like, you're using the epistemological failure of not knowing if something is true to actually liberate you from it, right? Because when the conspiracy makes you really nervous, and how do you know if the government isn't taking you over? Well, uncertainty almost becomes a kind of liberation, right? Like, you're taking uncertainty, which is usually anxiety producing, and then being uncertainty about the very source of the anxiety, thus negating the negation in a sense, and then you're kind of free of it. I think that's a really well put point. And there is something also about this treating someone differently. It's almost like the problem is a lot of those, like Jon Stewart, when they started, it felt like they weren't treating anyone differently. And then the comedy started to feel like it was treating a certain political party different than the other. And then it all failed, right? It moved from comedy to mockery. So there's something about comedy that has to at least convince people it's trying to speak to a universal condition, even if it's not, even if it fails. There just has to be a sense that it might be. And if it's not, then it's where the jester is trying to be king, or they're serving the king as opposed to doing a good job in being a jester or something. I'll have to consider that.
Sort of comment upon what Cadell was saying is very important. I think thinking about that, if you look at the political leaders today, especially the authoritarian turn that we have, you know, you can look at Trump in US, you can look at Modi in India. You can go to any of the Modi rallies. What you would find is a very intentional use of humor to actually activate the crowds. You know, he will, and it's very interesting that the more we laugh at him, and it's been now become a very evident fact in India, at least, I don't know about what's happening in US, that the more we laugh at him, and then the more we laugh at Trump also, the more support he gains. It's not like you are able to bring him down with laughing at him. The more jokes the left cracks at him, the more his supporters actually rile behind him in that sense. You know, and I said there's something about laughter and power that you have to think in these dynamics. Because here what we're seeing is that laughter is very intimately sort of coiled around jouissance in some senses. You know, it is enmeshed with a certain form of jouissance. And what you're doing by laughing at that person is you're again invoking that jouissance. So rather than giving up that libidinal object, that libidinal object actually gains a stronger position for the population. I'll not sort of try and develop this, but I think you need to look at this link between jouissance, perversion, and this form of laughter to actually unpack this kind of, because it is a perverse laughter. It is something perverse is going on in this switch.
That's it.
You know? Yeah, Cadell, please go ahead.
Just then, in this situation, I like this notion that in this situation, I think it is when the jesters become the kings, it's perverse. And I think that in this situation, we're also the connection I want to make is just the decline in biological reproduction. That our societies are failing to reproduce themselves. That our societies are fundamentally becoming perverse, which is fundamentally decoupling jouissance, decoupling sexual energy from reproduction.
Absolutely. You can see a certain form of decline within this. How do we unpack this at least in the context of late capitalism? What are the conditions in which this form of decoupling, this form of jouissance is getting? Because jouissance essentially is this directly getting hooked onto the dead drive without going to the instinctual route. That is where, jouissance sort of finds its. What are the conditions in which laughter itself is gaining its most perverse dimensions? I think those are questions we need to really think about. I'll not sort of develop it. It's going to take too long, but there's something about it, which we need to.
I agree, Cadell, that Teton's article in Abyssal Arrows was fire. So on this topic is really, really good. So well done, Teton. And everyone should buy a copy of Abyssal Arrows. You need to buy the book. So please, everyone. And Conspiracy in the Subject by Mr. Hunter. So I actually will be charging you a heck of an invoice for that little bit of music that I did there. As a closing thought, it's interesting because I completely agree where laughing at Trump strengthens Trump. And it's almost like the difference of how do you get people in Trump to laugh? Like, it's like the difference between laughing at and teaching people within to laugh. And like one of the things I think we have with a problem with conspiracies is people say laugh at QAnon versus help people laugh in QAnon. So the like teaching of the comedic spirit, because if there is something about comedy that is necessary for discernment and freedom, then it is only by, say, teaching the ability to be comic that someone can free themselves from something like QAnon or be able to discern how to leave a QAnon. But instead, we're doing the same where we laugh at from the outside. And I go back and forth because some people are like, oh, mockery is good. It can stop. I'm not sure. I feel like that's almost a testable hypothesis. And it seems like to me, laughing at just strengthens. So I'm not so sure on that. The last thing I'll say on the epistemological failure, it almost does seem that precisely the failure to fully articulate the epistemological failure is precisely the precondition of having things like laughter or mystery or tears or something that gives us something to live for, right? Because if there wasn't something that would ultimately always be an epistemological failure, there would be a theoretical limit to what the human could do or could know, and then we would get bored with it, right? And it's like precisely that when you listen to these different jokes that point to something that you might not be able to fully explain and yet can sense, you're able to laugh. And you actually need this combination of a failure to fully articulate, but at the same time sense. Like a true epistemological failure, you wouldn't even know was an epistemological failure, right? The moment you've even like recognized it as a kind of failure of thought, that means you're thinking about it. So how do you have it's almost like the thought that you know failed is precisely a gift because then you have an effort to think about it again. But the thoughts you like succeed at, no reason to think it anymore, it succeeded. Or the thought you don't know you failed at, you're not going to try because you don't even know it's there. So it could be something about the epistemological failure is indeed precisely the condition for humans having things they can be optimal at so they can fail well. So Mr. Last is dying better, dying well. There's something about failing better, failing well, where the epistemological failure is the it that you sense and then it goes away that has to be there to point at so that jokes can be funny, tears can be of something beautiful, and the human can be driven towards something that they always can be driven toward more if they can actually integrate with that lack and positivize it. So it's interesting to think that perhaps the epistemological failure is the thing, as you're describing, Javier, that must be failed to be brought into epistemology precisely so it can have the function. But hard to say. It's something we can all laugh about. Anyway, I hope you all have a great day.